So good morning to everybody and welcome to this session. And it's really a huge pleasure to be here with you today. And I think we really have a outstanding panel. So I think my job here is really just to kick us off and then hand it over to the real experts who are going to share a little bit about their work in this area. So I'll just start with an example. So when we look at what it takes to ship, to actually trade internationally, so to ship a container from Rotterdam in the Netherlands to Mombasa in Kenya, it takes a stack of paper around 25 centimeters tall. So imagine a big stack of paper like this. And that stack of paper has to be shared between around 30 different public and private actors. Back and forth, these pieces of paper and documents are shifting around more than 200 times. So you can imagine the amount of paper, the paper intensity of trade today. And that is really the reality in which we are living in today. And I think this panel is really going to look at sort of looking towards the future. We have a lot of opportunities to change that. The other, I think, important part about this conversation is indeed on the consumer side and the traceability side. So today, more than ever, there is demand from various stakeholders, whether it's players in the value chain, and consumers and others, governments, regulators, to really have information about products, where they're coming from, their provenance, how they're produced. For example, what are the emissions associated with the product, things like that. So those questions are really becoming more and more pressing. And of course, there's a great potential for these digital tools to actually help us to solve those types of issues. So with that, I think let's get started. So the idea of the panel is we'll have a kind of discussion with the speakers here, and then we'll have a good amount of time for your questions and engagement. So I'm going to start with a question for you, David. So domestically, can you tell us about the drivers you're seeing from the private sector perspective, the drivers you're seeing for the digitalization of supply chains?
Sure, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. So I'm with Infrabuild Steel. We manufacture and supply reinforcing steel. We make other products, but that's probably one of our biggest product ranges that we make. So we're delivering anything like 2,000 or 3,000 tonne of reinforcing steel a day. And so the big driver for us on digitalisation for ourselves and our customers is around productivity. If you think about a building site, it's about how do you get product into a building site, get it there safely, get it unloaded off the truck. So we've done a lot of work over the years on digital identification of our products, and that's led to a reduction in truck turnaround time for our customers and in our own operations. And now what we're seeing is an extension of that is the work that we've done on identifying our test certificates digitally. And we've given a unique identification to our test certificates, and what that's leading us to is around productivity on the administration side from a quality point of view. So not only is their products identified, but also the certification of our products identified digitally. And that's done uniquely so that each document has a globally unique ID. And so that not only helps on productivity, but it also leads the way to preventing on fraudulent misuse of our products or misrepresentation of our products.
No, thank you so much. And I think that's a really interesting point on the productivity quality side. And I think actually what you're doing is really groundbreaking. You don't see this type of effort being done. And so it's a really interesting example of how to use use technology to really deliver those gains and productivity gains that you mentioned. So Kim, maybe we can ask from your perspective as an accreditation in the accreditation world and also with the food sector focus. Do you see the bar being raised today with traceability initiatives, and what are the implications for conformity assessment?
It's a good question. I guess the point is that traceability is a tool. It's the ability to, in this context, to digitally link the conformity data relating to a product and to be able to track that product through the marketplace. So if you think about it, one of the key problems with any of this information, with traceability and conformity data, is trust. How can you trust that the information is correct? How can you trust that the organisation that is using the traceability tool actually understands how to use it and has the systems in place so that there are issues to do with the management of the process. Okay, thank you. So there's concerns around making sure that the organisation that uses traceability systems understands how to do it, and that the product that is going through the system is meeting the requirements of the customer. So it's a conformity to the requirements, and that you know where the product went to. All of those elements are essential in terms of driving down some of the problems that we have around fraud and substitution. So if you can understand that I think it was Deakin University in 2021 released a publication that was talking about the cost of fraud to the food sector in Australia being well over $2 billion a year. So these are important steps that have practical outcomes, not just for the consumer, but for the manufacturer and ultimately for the supply chain and Australia's exports as a whole.
Yeah, I think that's so crucially important, this question about the trust and also sort of how to follow the product in across the value chain. And I think that I think you both mentioned this concerns about fraud, illicit trade, and how to combat that. And I think indeed these types of tools and initiatives are going to be very, very important in that space. So Brett, maybe to turn to you now to share a little bit, to explain a bit about the work you're doing with UN CFAC. Maybe tell us more about that and how does that link in with this conversation?
Well, another thread to this whole picture is sustainability, and we're hearing more and more about it. And it appears that around 50% of claims that are made around products' sustainability are wrong. They're false or misleading, and this directly undermines the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. And so, therefore, they're putting a lot of work into ways of gaining reliable access to product data, especially sustainability data. And they're talking about electronic processes where data elements are ingested into digital networks. Now that's exactly what we're codifying at the CFAC group, which is their Centre for Trade Facilitation. And I want to give you just a glimpse of what that could look like. And I'll admit that this is in the quite specific context of sustainability claims and product circularity, but the approach that we've taken is very broad. We simply started with the premise that conformity assessment bodies, perhaps many of you, and the accreditations that stand behind that work offer or represent fundamental trust anchors in global supply chains. And so what stems from that initial assumption is the idea that conformity assessment bodies could convey their data as tamper-evident data packets that could not be copied or modified, and they would give insight into the certificate that you're issuing. So if I can give you the gist that the payload of this data packet is no longer the certificate itself, it's insights into what is contained in the certificate. And so if I get more specific, I could say that a data packet will contain a number of data elements, all of which are optional, but would normally include a web link to the issued certificate, which may be encrypted. It would also contain a web link to any accreditations that stand behind that work. And then it would contain specific trade-related data elements, like a traceable product identifier for the object of conformity assessment, like the result, which might be a statement of conformity to a standard, or perhaps a test result, a carbon footprint calculation, something like that. So because this data is electronic, it becomes possible to access this data in new ways, and most especially through scanning a product barcode. So I think we're seeing the start of a new world.
No, I mean, it's extremely important, this work, and I think I also find it shocking that 50% of claims on sustainability are false or misleading. And so, it's clear that actually we need ways to be able to better better address this, better have that have trust in the information that's associated with the product. And so linking up the physical product with the digital, I think that's a really important an important aspect. So maybe back to you, David. So could you tell us then more about the sustainability question and the emerging changes in sustainability legislation and how suppliers might be preparing for compliance?
Sure. And it's a really live topic for all of us. And in our business, it's an interesting one. And I think a lot of industries are grappling with it. They're seeing it from on high about, at this higher level about how do you verify about sustainability. But from my perspective, I think it actually comes back to the humble test certificate and our product. But I think what it is from our perspective, is the old classical definition of product conformance used to be for steel, the chemical and mechanical properties as reported on the test certificate. So, but what I think now is, through the lens of sustainability, is that the definition of product conformance is expanding. So it still includes the good old, chemical and mechanical properties, but now we also need to be able to certify around that bundle of steel that's being delivered the environmental aspects of it. And so we do in our business, we do our environmental product declarations, but that's over a 2 or 3 year period worth of data. So you can see that over time, what we're going to have to do is actually bring it down to data that's more meaningful to the truck that's being delivered. And so I think it's a really interesting role for our labs to play as well in terms of that whole verification and traceability aspect of the product. So we're seeing that, we anticipate that we'll have a new certificate that will mimic our test certificate, but will be around the environmental and social and governance aspects of the products that we're being delivered. And we'll be looking to what the standards are around that has to apply to and comply with and be accredited to.
No, thank you. I mean, it's obviously in a sector like steel, it's a big challenge and complex to get that information. But of course, there'll be more and more demands for that information. So that's, again, I think it's looking forward to these new digital solutions will really be important. And I think maybe also, Kim, I think it would be interesting to hear also in the food sector space, sort of what are the challenges that you see and sort of the progress that's being made to digitalize the certification space in the food sector?
Digitalisation of certification and accreditation data, so that's the space that we're talking about really. So that supports a verifiable digital system that ensures the product integrity. The challenge is incorporating that into a broader framework for businesses, because as David was just saying, there's a variety of elements that come into it. For example, a conformity assessment for ethical trade, for social compliance, for energy consumption. Those are all components that go into the business as a whole. So part of this is about how you integrate into the business, because it's the business that makes the value out of this. The data though is dynamic. It's constantly changing. The conformity assessment certificate that was issued can be withdrawn or suspended or expire. The products can be recalled because of whatever reason. So it brings into question the specific circumstances of production, and so there's a whole range of things. So the digital data is constantly changing, and what you need is real-time ability to interrogate the data. What was a certificate last week? You want to know that that's still a valid certificate this week. It's also important to be able to historically access the data. So the product that was manufactured last year that sat in a warehouse for distribution and finally gets through the supply chain, you need to be able to trace back what was the standard that it was assessed against, because the standards change as well. So the challenge for CABs, for our certification bodies in this space, is to be able to embed and support unique identifiers related to the conformity assessment and the products that are covered under that assessment. Just because a facility has been assessed for their management system or their product system doesn't necessarily cover every product that's manufactured in that site. There can be exclusions. So the real part of this is the discoverability of digital data. And that is about the ability to drive end-to-end visibility through the supply chain. End-to-end visibility is related to your traceability, but it's different. It's about being able to identify whether the product has been tested, what the conformity criteria were, what the laboratory is, what's the standing of the laboratory or the conformity assessment body that did the work, were they actually in scope when they did that work? All of those questions come up related to that digital environment. So this can be can also support better predictions in the supply chain. So the digitalisation process isn't just about conformity and standards, it's also about movement and track and trade. It's also about the responsiveness of industry in terms of the needs and changing needs for industry and consumers as well. So there's a variety of things that occur in the process of manufacturing. A change to the supply chain may mean that the ingredients that a manufacturer was using have had to be sourced from a new supplier and now they've got an allergen in it. Well, that's fine, but you need to be able to inform the consumer that this has got an allergen, so you need to change your labels and so on and so forth. So there's a variety of things that can be useful in this discussion of thinking we can do business. It's how to make business more sustainable into the future. What are the advantages? It's not all about AI. I know it's great to have it, but there's processes that we've got in place that we need to build to actually support a digital system and get the value out of it.
No, I think it's really important in understanding this idea of how the business, on the one hand, will integrate the digital into their supply chain, and then the value that can be brought on, in terms of the work of certification bodies and managing supply chains. I think it's a really, really interesting perspective, so thank you. Brett, maybe we can ask you sort of from where you're sitting, sort of what's the progress that you see in the digitization and in this UN work more broadly?
Well, in the trade space more broadly, the progress is phenomenal, and I don't know if the audience here is following this. Devin talked about the stack of papers. That stack of papers is threatening to be winnowed down fairly quickly. We have single window, digital electronic single window initiatives starting up all around the world and quite advanced in some countries, including the US. We have things like electronic bills of lading based on the UN CITRAL model law, and it also is being adopted quite rapidly by many countries. The International Chamber of Commerce has created digital templates for a vast array of trade documents, and we all know about digital product passports. So when we drill down into conformity data, though, we have to say, well, we seem to be lagging behind a bit, and this is, I think, partly driving the work at the UN. But it's not all bad news, because if there are any calibration people in the audience here at the moment, you would be well aware of the Digital Calibration Certificate Initiative, which is a really ambitious project. It's a full certificate digitalisation, quite daunting actually to think about implementing. And I think probably for areas outside of calibration, it's a bridge too far at this time, and we need to find a more middle path. So if we look to what's happening here in Australia, I could point to our Department of Agriculture. They've got a number of interesting projects underway. My mic just cut out. But I would draw your attention to one in particular, which is the AgTrace project. They've run pilots in red meat and horticulture, and that work is explicitly built on the UN protocols that I was mentioning a moment ago. So I think whilst we could view this as a threat, yes, if we get left behind, maybe alternative processes will step up, and I do think they would, but we don't want to be left behind. I want you to see this as an opportunity, not a threat. There is an opportunity for CABs, conformity assessment bodies, to provide new services, new value to their customers. At least in the sustainability space, customers of CABs are going to start feeling pressure to provide traceable conformity data. Now, you can help them with that if you are a conformity assessment body. There are ways that you can help embed that information even into your existing certificates, and maybe in the future into some of these data packets that I've been talking about. So I would say embrace the opportunities that are going to come from this emerging digital trade environment. Just make it happen, and you may reap the rewards.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good perspective, and thinking about it in terms of the sort of new value, new services, but also new demands. And I think we see that in trade today. There's more and more demands, especially on the sustainability side, and in other ways as well. But as well, you have governments that are going to be coming in as well. I mean, we've been talking here more about sort of businesses, the work of CABs and different sectors, but as well, governments are going to be asking more and more for that type of information. And so how can we leverage these types of digital trade initiatives to make that easier, to reduce the burden ultimately on business, and get that information to suppliers that's needed. So we have a few minutes now to take some questions from the audience. So I'm not sure if anybody has linked into the app to pose questions.
I'll make a start, I think. So I'm pretty lazy. So what we did in Infrabuild, rather than trying to invent something from scratch, we looked around and we actually leveraged off what we saw happening in fast-moving consumer goods. So we actually use the GS1 standards, which are now Australian standards actually, around identification of our products and of our documents. And through that process, that it's now Australian standard 14549, just been ratified. What that allows us to do, it actually means that we can allocate an identification number to our products, and be confident that because that's under that regime of that Australian and ISO standard, that is a unique identification for that material. And similarly with the test certificates, we're also using an identifier for our test certificates. So that means that I can be very confident that test certificate that I've issued is a unique document globally. And by cross-referencing the bundles of materials that have their GTIN and serial number, each of those is a globally unique ID. So it's a very simple structure, and then that allows us to, and it's still early days for us, so it's more about just that administrative side around how to allocate some numbers, but be confident that the numbers themselves are unique. Therefore, the data that sits underneath those unique identifiers is protected in that area.
I'd be happy to give another perspective, and I'll perhaps confine myself to the area that I know, which is the UN work. So one of the prerequisites really for our work is that we must avoid any reliance on a proprietary system or platform, and any sort of locally generated standards, and preferably we rely on open architecture and international standards. So if we talk specifically about the exchange mechanisms, which I didn't really go into in my earlier comments, the preferred or the suggested approach within this UN work that I'm talking about is the use of a W3C verifiable credential. Verifiable credentials are everywhere now, you probably know about them, but the W3C version of it is an open architecture standard run by the World Wide Web Consortium that developed HTTP, that makes the internet work, that sort of thing. So if you wanted the technical details for that protocol, you could go to the W3C GitHub, where you can learn all about it. It is open source. You could even contribute to the work if you wanted to.
Thank you.
Look, I don't think I really can add much more for the conversation. I agree with what with both Brett and David just said. The main thing with this is that it's using the original data or the source data, that you're not going to create another database sitting somewhere. This is actually going back to the source. But in order to be able to do that, then you need to have the recognised international standards on which the data is based.
That's a critical point, yeah, I'm glad you said that.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a few other questions in a similar area, but one is specifically asking about how do we ensure a link between the digital certificate to a physical product?
It's a huge question.
Everyone took a breath then.
I mean, it's a huge question. It's staggeringly complex. And I guess in my comments, I've been focusing on the link that a conformity assessment body can make between a physical product and the data that they issue. And the reason that I've made that point is I think arguably the biggest gap in supply chains currently is the failure to link physical product to conformity data. It's the holy grail. But if you think about all the components that go into that, I would say at the very centre, right at the kernel of that problem, is the conformity assessment body. They are the ones that are putting their hand potentially on the product, or at least evaluating it, and actually issuing the data. So if they're not making that connection, how the heck is anyone else going to make that connection? But perhaps I'll leave it to Dave to explain some of the other subsequent problems around traceability. But at least if we can get the conformity body link settled, that would be a very important base to work from, I think.
Yep, no, I agree with that. And it's the holy grail for us is around, so when every bundle of steel that we manufacture, and they're normally about 2 tonne, 4 tonne coils or straight length bars of steel, if you know steel, and each one of those in our business will be tagged, and the tag will have a barcode on it, and that tag and barcode is globally unique to that bundle. So it's that DNA for that one. And that's great, but the next challenge for us technically is going to be when that bundle is broken up and the individual bars are used on site. Now we have bar mill markings that tell you which mill it came from, but yeah, the holy grail for us is then how do we actually get an identification onto the surface of the steel. So that's an active project that smarter blokes than me are working on, and but there's a couple of options. And I think one of the things too is that if we talk about fabricated steel, for getting really steel oriented here, is I think there's a lot of direct part marking, and so I think what we're going to start to see is more focus on the alignment of the direct part marking with what's been digitally recorded and digitally identified, so that there is a one-to-one link, and that starts opening up things like the digital link, where you actually take advantage of some of the protocols that Brett's taken and unlock all of those. So it'll be around challenges of direct part marking, and I think the other secret weapon's going to be the smartphone. It's going to be just become ubiquitous around being used in all facets of the supply chain, and because a lot of this too is the emphasis has to be not about what we're doing and recording, to an authority or to a contract owner or something like that. The emphasis has to be how do you make the job easier for the people on the front line, the person unloading from the truck, the person delivering to site, the person putting the reinforcing steel in place. If we can make their job easier and more and save them time, make their job safer, the byproduct will be that if they're using their smartphone to help them do their job, in the background that you can do the digital verification without them even knowing it's being done for you. It's being fed back in, ultimately, in construction into a BIM model, so that you actually know that bit of steel went into that part of the building as per the design. So I think it's an exciting space.
And when you say making the job easier, what you're saying is the data is being recorded. So yes, you can use a smartphone to scan the QR code and check that it's the correct bundle, but that scan is also recording onto your cloud system to make sure that the data is being captured. I mean, when we're talking before about the food and traceability, and at the moment the application of traceability is in relatively simple products, a bottle of wine, meat, they're single commodity products. Theoretically, the meat pie that you can buy from the supermarket should be traceable. Yes, that traces back to the factory, but the salt, the pepper, the onions, the tomato, the flour, all of those components that go into making the meat pie, not just the meat, should also be traceable. So each of those contributing producers needs to have their own system, and that needs to capture it. So again, it comes back to the fact that this is only going to work if we have international standards and we're not building new proprietary databases. Yes, you can apply blockchain, but blockchain doesn't actually do what we're talking about. It's just linking stuff together. It doesn't work on improving visibility. It doesn't work on digitalisation in terms of connectability.
And to come back to this example of the meat pie, I mean, many of those ingredients are coming across borders.
Yes.
And the systems and data that's going to be coming into, being fed into whatever end result you have also needs to be interoperable, okay, based on international standards, but the data needs to be able to flow between the systems. And so we're not there yet. I mean, we're far from that today. And I think that's really sort of how, and different countries are at very different stages of readiness, different sectors as well. So how that will sort of feed down is a really interesting question.
It does come, so it comes back to the question about the role of the conformity assessment body, the laboratory. So all of those pieces of data are ultimately owned by the business. I mean, you as the conformity assessment body generated the data, but it's the business that needs to use that data and link that data back into the production. So we're talking about a meat pie. So you've got one batch of onions that comes from Mexico and one batch of onions that comes from Australia, and so on and so forth. So just because a conformity assessment body has looked at the production system once in a year to ensure their production systems are working, that's not the end of that story. Okay, so it's how business uses this, and we've got to provide the infrastructure that makes it easy for business to adopt and apply it.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the floor? No, that's okay. I have more here. Okay. So obviously, with all these advancements and the digitalisation comes the opposite, the risk of data breach, and obviously there's been a lot of that recently in various organisations across the world. So how do you see companies managing the data breaches, and what measures could be taken to ensure that they don't occur and we have more trust in the systems that you're going to be relying on in this process?
I could perhaps just note, and it alludes to something that Kim mentioned, is that in every case, in the models that we've been talking about, the interrogation, the discoverability is always back to source. And I guess the risk that we're more concerned about is making sure that nobody can copy that data or fob it off as something that it's not. So so long as we're going back to source, I think we're eliminating some of the modes of failure in this system. Now, if we're talking digital product passports, well, yes, there will need to be registries where suppliers of product would register their product and provide the various links to the data, including perhaps conformity data. And there are many, many pilots underway around the world. I think there might even be about 70 in Europe. So, I mean, this has been a very well explored and tested area. But I think the risks may be of a more limited and specific nature than perhaps you might first think.
Any other thoughts?
I'm not an IT person, but it is, it's a real challenge, and it exists for us on like 3 levels, because we'll make product claims about what we manufacture. So we need to be confident that those product claims that we make aren't amended somewhere through the value chain. If we say it meets these mechanical properties, we want our customers and end users to know that that's what it is and not something else. Mm-hmm. Then you've got, as Kim was saying, you want to know when the product left our mill, that it made it to site. So, we do that through, we've got telematics in the trucks that make deliveries for us, so we can actually track all their deliveries. And then, as to what Brett was saying, then it's around the product claims, the actual results and how the security. I don't know about that. I leave that to my IT colleagues to do. But that's, it's a real challenge.
It is a challenge.
But again, it gets back to by having that unique identification, you can actually, so we're not there yet, but one of the things is by knowing that that certificate only covers 24 tonne of steel, if I can see that someone's making a report to a building owner that this certificate covers 200 tonne of steel, immediately it's a red flag. Or if that certificate gets quoted for a job in Broome, Western Australia, but we delivered it to Melbourne, so we're not there yet, but it's more about getting the foundational stuff. And I think actually that sort of, I want to call out the work that Brett's alluded to and ask anyone, go onto the NATA website, have a look at the work that Brett's been doing, because it is actually world class. The whole proposal is, and around verifiable credentials and product conformity, is groundbreaking. And I just think it's important to call out that the quality and the innovation that Brett's led on that work.
Well, I could make thank you very much. I could make a plug, actually. If you do have any interest in particular the UN work, there was a white paper released last year. You may have seen news of that. The phase 2, which is the specification, has actually been written and has been submitted for publication. So I expect that to be available in the public domain within a couple of weeks. So we'll put something in NATA News about that. But if you wanted more immediate advice, you could check me on LinkedIn. I'll certainly be putting something up on that when that's available.
Okay, thank you very much. I can see everyone's on time with our schedule, so can please take our panellists for their informative discussion.